This is my first ever miniature, a Space Marine from a box set called Warriors of the Imperium, which I got just before my 12th birthday. And you can see I've made a few mistakes on the model. The eyes are sort of painted in roughly the right place, but the white paint underneath it is put on so thick that you can't really see where those eye lenses start and finish. And would you believe that was all applied using a fine detail brush as well? Now, I'm actually really proud of this miniature, and I keep it around for one main reason, and that reason is it's a constant reminder that there's a lot of things that might seem obvious in miniature painting, but if no one tells you what they are, you're just not going to know, and then you're going to make those mistakes. So in this video, what we're going to do is look at some of those things. 6 things, exactly. 6 things that I wish I knew when I started painting miniatures. The first thing that I wish I knew was something that's become a little bit of a meme that follows me around, but it is a really important thing to understand, and that is to thin your paints. Now, originally, no one told me anything about this, so instead what I did was just get the paints I wanted and just slap them onto the miniature straight out the pot, because why wouldn't I? And the result was, well, my first Space Marine. Let's take another look at him. You can see just how thick the paint is on this miniature. I really gunked it on because, well, the first colour I used on this was Skull White, which is an old Citadel paint, because I wanted all the armour to be white, and you can see I really had to put it on really thickly to get it to have that solid coverage, and the result was, well, it wasn't diluted at all. It went all thick and lumpy, and in particular when it comes to the finer detail, like on the chest just there, you can sort of see where that chest design was supposed to be, and his face, oh, his poor face. Look, the mouthpiece is completely filled in. It's lost all the detail. It's just horrible. So what I ought to have done was, of course, thin my paints. Now, the reason why I do this is because straight out the pot, the paint is often too thick, and it varies quite a lot from paint to paint and manufacturer to manufacturer too, and over time you'll kind of get a feel for it as to what you want. It's worth noting that some colours tend to be very pigment heavy, and these tend to be quite thick ones, so reds are a great example, and that's what we're going to show you right now. I've got some Mephiston red here from Citadel, and what I'm going to do is just put some onto the palette here. Straight out the pot, you can see it behaves, it's quite viscous there. As I move it around, it doesn't drip very much. And when you put it onto the palette, it kind of, well, if you twist it on like that, you can get a real lump of it like that. So you can see straight away, if you paint that onto the miniature like that, that's the kind of result that you're going to get. Really lumpy, quite horrible. So what you need to do is thin it down with some water. So what I'm going to do is just load up the brush with some water and start mixing it in. And when you do this, the thing to understand is that there's kind of a sweet spot that you need to get experience in so you understand what to get to. Every colour is slightly different, but generally what you're looking for is to get it so it flows off the brush really easily, but not so easily that it runs out of control. So watch out with the water. If you put in quite a lot like this, what you'll get is a really, really runny version of it. And when you start applying this, whilst it will go smooth, it's also going to go everywhere. And you can see it's really translucent as well. It's not got good coverage. That's too much. So instead you want a kind of midpoint between the two. So what I'm going to do is just use the palette to create that by mixing the water with the paint that I have there, kind of going like that. And what I'm looking for is a fairly strong coverage. It doesn't have to be perfect, but what it needs to do is be flowing smoothly from the brush. And as I start painting it out like that, you can see it's actually really smooth now. That's the kind of thing that I want. And you can use the palette here to test it by just painting along and seeing what you get. That's much more the kind of thing that you want. You see, it's so much smoother now. All that lumpiness has gone away and it's just flowing very easily from the brush, and I've got lots of control over where it goes. So that's the kind of thing you want to get for. So if you get your paint down like that and start applying it to your miniature, you'll find you get a much smoother finish to things, but you'll also find, because of that translucency there, it will show some of the colour beneath through it. So this might be the undercoat or something else you painted so far in the miniature. This isn't a problem. This is where the second meme comes along of 2 thin coats. All you do is apply that first coat, let it dry, then apply a second coat in the exact same way. And this way, the detail becomes nice and sharp still, but also you get that smooth, consistent finish to the colour. And if you do stuff like that, you'll get results much more like this one here, which you can see is a Space Marine in the same kind of colour scheme as the original one, but the armour is so much smoother, everything's much neater, it's just much, much better. The second thing I wish I knew when I started painting was why use a palette. Now, very early on, I was told that you need to use a palette, but no one explained to me how or why. So what I went and did was, as advised, get hold of a tile, and then I'd take the paint out of the pot, put it onto the tile, then from the tile onto the miniature. So to be honest with you, I may as well not even bother because I didn't do anything to the paint at all. May as well just gone straight from the pot. But as you've seen in the previous part, the palette is actually incredibly useful because it allows you to check what the paint's going to do. It gives you the control over it. So it allows you to thin it down with some water and then try painting onto the palette, see what it's going to do onto your miniature. And then allows you to get rid of excess paint off your brush so that you've got that fine control that you'll need when you're painting all those smaller details. So incredibly useful. And to be honest with you, I can't really do without one these days. Now for the palette we often use, we just use a tile like I did back in the day. This time though, what I've done is made sure it's a white one, because a white palette means that you can clearly see what the colour is going to look like on your miniature, so always go for a white one. The advantage of a tile is that it's really cheap. We got this one from a hardware store for next to nothing, and it's also ceramic, which means it's really easy to clean as well, so a really useful thing to have, especially when you're starting out. Now, if you want to go a little bit further, there is an alternative kind of palette, which is a wet palette, and we've got one just here. This is one made by the Army Painter, but there's loads of different sorts available from different companies, and you can even make one yourself if you wanted to. But the big advantage of a wet palette is that it keeps the paint wetter for longer. So what you can do is do some painting one evening, close it up, come back to it the next day, and the paint will still be usable. It's also really good if you're going to do some more advanced techniques. Things like blending and glazing is really good for getting the paint to the correct point that you want for those sort of techniques. So if you're serious about your painting, you want to get hold of one of these at some point. Now on the downside, it doesn't work very well with washers, so you'll want to stick to your tile for using those kind of paints. And in addition, there's a small chance with metallic paints that some of the metal flecks in them can get into the sponge and then contaminate other colours on the palette. So it's something worth thinking about. It's always a good idea to have both palettes on hand in case you need either of these different sorts of colours, these different types of paint. You can always jump back and forth as you need to, which is what I tend to do. So they're incredibly useful. I definitely recommend you get hold of palettes, and as I said, I really couldn't do without them these days. The next thing I wish I knew when I started out painting was what brush to use, because initially I quite naively assumed that the finer the brush you had, the better the miniature was going to be overall. So what I did was start looking for the very smallest brush I could find, which at the time was a Citadel fine detail brush. And using this brush, I promptly set out painting my Space Marines, starting out with the initial one. So here he is once again. You can see it contributed towards the lumpiness of it because I really started gunking the paint on because it was taking so long. I just wanted to get it, get that colour on there. And it didn't help at all with that finer detail because, oh, that poor face. But it wasn't just this guy I painted with that brush. It was him and his whole squad, including all the heavy weapons and things, and then the characters. I even painted a Rhino armoured personnel carrier with that fine detail brush, painting it all white straight over the plastic. And if you think he's lumpy, you should have seen that tank. I wish I still had it to show you, but it was awful, it looked terrible, and the whole experience just wasn't fun either because it took forever to do it. What I should have done is started out with a medium-sized brush that would have been much more appropriate to this Space Marine and the rest of them, and then looked to expand the collection as I needed to, as I encountered different requirements for the different brushes. So a larger one for that Rhino would have been great, then a finer one for the finer detail. These days I tend to stick around a small little handful of brushes that are great for just about everything. And what I tend to use is small to medium-sized brushes for most things like layering and highlighting. Then I've got a slightly larger brush that I use for my initial base coats, a larger brush than that for applying large amounts of washes to miniatures, and then a small dry brush as well, which is great for texture on the models and the bases, all that kind of thing. Now, if you get a small selection of brushes, you'll find they cover you for most things, and then from there you can quite easily add to your collection depending on what you need when you need it. For example, a really large brush when it comes time to start painting some scenery and dry brushing it to pick out all of that texture. If you look after these brushes as well, they'll last you for a long time, and a few key things to know are to not leave them standing, especially bristles down because it'll bend the bristles. Also be sure not to get any paint on the ferrules because that'll start to split the point. And also if you want to really look after them, get hold of some brush soap as well to really nourish those bristles. Now eventually the brushes will start to wear out and you'll want to replace them, but keep those older ones because they're still useful, especially for rough jobs. Things like putting PVA glue on the base of your models when you want to do the texture and you want to stick the sand on there, and also for that initial rough base coat that you want to apply to a model. They can be really useful for that kind of thing. But the important thing to look for is to get that initial handful of brushes, which will cover you for most things, and then the most important thing out of that is to always pick the right brush for the job. Another thing I wish I knew when I started out painting is when to be messy and when to be neat. Because this is something I assumed straight away, and it's a mistake I often see people making, and it's to think that you must only apply a base coat of a colour only onto the areas of the model that you want to be that colour. And the fact is this isn't true, because you can easily neaten up the model as you go along applying further base coats. Now when you're doing this, all you need to do is avoid the areas that you want to retain the initial colours on, and not worry about anything else, because by the time you get to the final base coat, you'll neaten everything up as you go along. Now, to show you what I mean in practice, what I've got is a Lannister Guardsman from A Song of Ice and Fire, and what I'm going to do is start painting Corn Red from Citadel onto his coat, which is the main colour for the miniature. It's usually a good idea to start out with the main colour model like this, and so what we need to do is to use the palette just like we saw earlier on to get the paint ready. So first of all, some paint on there, then a touch of water to thin it down, just checking on the palette to make sure it's nice and smooth, so a little bit more water I think. There we go, a bit more paint, and then just testing it. Yeah, there we go, getting good coverage and it's nice and smooth. So this, load up and then start applying it to the model. Now, what I mean initially by people being really neat is looking for anything that's going to be another colour and just avoiding it. So the belts around here, for example, what people do and what I did was start applying the colour like this, going only up to those details like that and avoiding them and working their way around them. Now you can see doing this is actually quite slow going, and when you do whole armies like this, it's very, very tedious. The fact is you don't have to do it because that belt, I'm going to be painting it brown later on, so it doesn't actually matter. You can just paint the whole thing like this, just working your way around, just making sure that all the bits that you want to be this red colour are this red colour. Now this is why it's so important to make sure you thin your paints, because as you can see by doing this, you are going to be applying a few more coats because there's some red on that belt now and it needs to be painted brown later on. So just make sure you thin your paints down so the detail stays nice and sharp, so by the time you're finished, you keep the sharpness and it's then easier to do the highlights as well. So as you can see, by doing this, it's just much, much quicker to paint that coat. So remember, initially, don't worry about being neat. You'll find you neaten the miniature up as you add further coats to the model. The next thing I wish I knew is something that I really wish someone had talked to me about, and that's not to fear making mistakes, because mistakes are going to happen. It's just inevitable, really. No matter how long you've been painting or how experienced you are going to make some mistakes, and it's worth knowing that no matter how bad it is, it can be rectified. Even colour schemes on miniatures that are notorious for having really difficult elements to fix on them, such as an Imperial Fist Space Marine, can easily be fixed when you know how. What you've got to watch out for is when the initial mistake is made, just to quickly wash away some of the excess paint if you can, using a bit of water. It doesn't really matter if you can't, but this makes it easy to fix up. After that, all you've got to do is just re-establish a colour scheme, and in this case that means going back to some Wraithbone first of all to block out the area where the mistake happened, and then to re-establish the mid-tone with some Uriel Yellow. And there you go, you wouldn't even know the mistake had been made there. And because the coats of paint are so thin, you can't even see any texture from them either. So remember, it's going to happen. Mistakes are going to be made. I make them all the time, but so long as you know how to react to them, it's very easy to fix. And in fact, it's through these mistakes that you're going to learn and become a better painter. The last thing I wish I knew when I was starting out was about undercoating your miniatures. Because initially nobody actually told me about this, and what I did was just paint the paint straight onto the plastic of the miniature, and the result was it rubbed off and scratched off pretty quickly, so my response was just to gunk some more paint on there, obscuring even more detail. Now, undercoating the model is really important because it is what allows the paint to stick to your miniature, so you always need to apply a primer, and spray primers are brilliant for this kind of thing. These days there's loads of colours available. Way back then there was only white and black, and we've got actually some examples here. We've got three. We've got both a white and a black one, but also a grey one in the middle. And all three are Lannister Guardsmen for A Song of Ice and Fire, and we've painted half of each of them using some corn red, because the colour you use for the undercoat will actually affect the overall tone of the miniature, and you can see that clearly here. From a white undercoat, what we've got is a corn red that's more bright and punchy, so if you're going for a brighter and punchier colour scheme, this can really emphasise this. So if you're going for a bright red, for example, or yellow, a white undercoat is perfect. It's also great if you're going to be using a lot of contrast paints because the white really shows through the tint that they give to give a really nice bright finish to things. Now the complete opposite, what we've got is a black undercoat, and this is great because it essentially provides instant shading on your miniature. If you're starting from a black undercoat, you don't have to paint everything because details like little nooks and crannies and things, if you leave them black, it looks like shadow. So if you're looking to paint models quickly, then this is a great starting point. It's also much more forgiving when it comes to mistakes than a white undercoat is. Now in the middle we've got grey, and this is my personal favourite because it kind of gets the best of both worlds there. You can go to very bright colours very quickly, but also very dark colours very quickly and get a smooth even finish for both. So if you're new to the hobby and you're not sure what kind of colour to go for, I'd recommend grey because with this you'll find you can paint just about anything. So there you are, the 6 things that I wish I knew when I started painting. But if you are struggling with your painting and you're getting frustrated with it, then don't worry. Odds are it's going to be something amongst these 6 subjects that's causing you the trouble, just like it did with me. So just be sure to review what you're doing, think about it, and keep practicing because you will get the hang of it. Anyway, we really hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting, and we'll see you all again very soon.